Jessica Sprick and learning about addressing absenteeism and truism. Jessica, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jackie, and thank you all of you who are taking time out of your very busy schedules to attend the webinar today. I see we've got a really great attendance, and I know we had lots of people signed up who are planning on watching the video that we'll be sending out a link to that in the next couple of days. So again, thank you guys so much for attending and being willing to address this truly critical issue of absenteeism and truancy. My name is Jessica Sprick, and I'm a trainer and writer for Safe and Civil Schools, and recently have been devoting a lot of my time and energy to helping schools and districts tackle this issue of absenteeism and truancy, which we're just finding is so pervasive, and schools are really hungry for solutions to these problems. As I'm looking at the attendee list, just from the handful of folks who indicated which school districts they're from, I'm very excited to see that we have representation from at least 15 different states, everything from Alaska, Oregon, and Washington on the West Coast all the way over to the East Coast, and we're looking at New York, Florida, Maine, Virginia. So thank you guys so much for attending today. I'm going to start with just sort of a silly no-brainer statement, which is for students to be successful in school, they have to actually be in school. And it's such a no-brainer, it's such a common sense thing that we need to get our kids attending regularly if we want them to be demonstrating any measure of academic, behavioral, social success in our school systems. But what we are finding nationwide is that this is truly one of the most critical issues, but it's also one of the most under-addressed. So let me go into our goals for the session today. My first goal is that we will end pretty much right on time at the hour mark. I may need to extend that time a little bit to answer questions, but I will try and do that at the end, so you can feel free to stay logged on or watch that as the video later. I will also send out answers to any questions in a written format as well within the next several days. So let's start out with the goals. And one of the things that we've found with our research is that we've got a wide body of research emerging that there are far too many kids who are missing really worrisome amounts of school. And we do have a wealth of research that indicates there are lots of negative associated effects, but we actually have very little research that's specific to absenteeism about what we can do to solve the problem. And so one of my goals today is that we apply what we already know works with changing any student or human behavior to how we address our absenteeism issues in school. And really, as we know with any of our academic and behavioral initiatives, that starts with data-driven decision-making. So we have to start with looking at where are we now in our individual schools and within our districts, use our data to set meaningful priorities that are more likely to make a difference, and then monitor our prevention and intervention efforts over time. So I'm going to be talking about how to collect meaningful data as regards our absenteeism information. We're also going to look at how to apply evidence-informed practices for what we already know works with changing student behavior, both on preventative and intervention levels, and applying that research base and knowledge to absenteeism, and really trying to put our systems into multi-tiered systems of support so that we've got universal prevention happening, and that's where the bulk of our energy and resources is going to try and prevent problems from occurring in the first place, really implementing those proactive and preventative strategies that are most likely to make a difference, and then intensifying our efforts as students demonstrate increased levels of need. So we're going to be looking at that multi-tiered system and how to apply function-based approaches to our intervention efforts. My next set of goals is that you leave this session with some really practical, easy to implement strategies for each tier. So obviously in an hour I'm not going to be able to share a ton of strategies, and it is just kind of the tip of the iceberg, but hopefully these things will sort of prompt your thinking about how to create some prevention and intervention at each stage of your multi-tiered systems. So we'll look at some school-wide prevention efforts, some small group and perhaps early stage intervention interventions you might do with students when we're in the initial stages of intervention, and then how to start intensifying our efforts with more function-based approaches for individual students. I'm going to start with just addressing that we don't really know truly nationwide the extent of this problem because we just are not currently collecting the data that we need to. And what we're finding is that very few schools or districts are looking at a metric of chronic absenteeism. And I'm going to share what chronic absenteeism is in a moment. It's kind of the most important piece of data that we want to collect. But currently nationwide, we've only got data from about 9 states on this. So some of the research that I'm going to be sharing with you about the extent of the problem is basically based on sort of the data that we currently have and trying to extrapolate based on what that might look like nationwide. And currently one of the reasons that we don't know how big this problem is that many schools are really focusing on truancy. And so we have truancy courts and truancy officers that are looking at students who fit this metric of truancy. But truancy only includes unexcused absences. And so we're primarily triggering our intervention systems at middle and high school levels. But as we know, we've got lots of kids who are missing in elementary school, and even once they get to middle school and high school, we've got lots of kids who may be missing and they're getting those absences excused. So they may not actually be getting captured within that data of truancy. Another piece of data that many schools are collecting is average daily attendance. And average daily attendance, or ADA, is a fabulous whole school measure that we can look at. It's basically looking at, across the course of the school year, what percentage of our enrolled students are in attendance each day. And so many schools do collect this data and are using it to set goals. They're using it to look at how are we doing. But the issue with average daily attendance is it's not looking at the breakdown of which individuals are contributing to absences within the school. So it can actually mask a pretty significant problem in some schools, where some schools have actually found even if we have 95% average daily attendance, which is typically seen as fairly good, they could have even up to 30% of their students chronically absent. And basically that occurs when we've got lots of students who have really good attendance, but then we've got that 30% or more of students who really struggle with getting to school regularly. So average daily attendance, while a useful measure, actually needs to be paired with this next piece, which is chronic absence. And we are actually recommending, and what's emerging sort of nationwide is that there's a recommendation that all schools and all districts start looking at chronic absence, which is students who miss 10% or more of the school year for any reason. And so it's actually a combined measure of any absences students accumulate that are unexcused, excused, and suspension. And when I work with a lot of schools, the question frequently comes up, especially with suspension, why are we combining that together? Because the school is the one telling students to stay home or telling them to be outside of the classroom for in-school suspension. And really the reason goes to this second bullet point, that anytime a student is not in school, whether it's unexcused, excused, or suspension, there are negative effects. And the most obvious is that if the student isn't in school, there's a pretty good likelihood that they may start falling behind academically, but there's a host of other negative effects that are associated with chronic absenteeism. So we do recommend that as a way to look at the data, do look at any student who's missing 10% or more of the school year, combined unexcused, excused, and suspension. Now, let's look a little bit deeper about what that 10% means and why we look at it in terms of a percentage rather than a number of days. And basically it's because we don't want to wait until the end of the year to start doing intervention. We know that the earlier we can intervene with any type of issue, the more likely we are to have a positive effect, and that we can do it usually with less time and fewer resources. So we actually recommend that you track this metric of chronic absenteeism regularly throughout the school year, especially in the early parts of the year. So in the first 20 or 30 days of school, we would want to print a list of all of the kids who have missed 10% of that first 20 or 30 days. So in the first 30 days of school, we print a list of all of the kids who have had 3 or more absences. By the first 100 days of school, we're getting that list of students who have missed 10 days or more. And by the end of the year, if we have a 180-day school year, any student who's missed 18 days or more. And what we know is that it's the cumulative effect of these absences, not just that they're happening all within a week or two, but even if they're sporadic absences over time, they can have a really negative effect. Now, if you look at that first bullet point, 3 days in the first 30 days of school, one of the things I want to clarify up front is that we're not saying that any student who has had 3 days of absence in the first 30 days of school is going to require a full-blown functional behavioral assessment or really intensive intervention. Let's say we have a student who has a fairly good history in school, has had little behavioral issues, has not had a history of chronic absenteeism, and does fairly well academically, but this student gets a flu bug in the first 30 days and misses 3 or 4 days of school. I likely am not going to say I'm going to intervene with really intensive interventions right away. Maybe it's just that I'm putting that student's name down on a list that I need to kind of be aware that I want to monitor the student's attendance in the next 30 days. Whereas another student who has had a history of chronic absenteeism or within that first 30 days of school has already had a few behavioral referrals or is already really struggling academically or behaviorally, that might trigger some early intervention. So we're going to use that data to then make some logical discriminations as to how we address our intervention practices. So one thing to note is that as we're looking at this measure of chronic absenteeism across the course of a school year, if a student is averaging 2 days or more a month, he or she would be considered chronically absent. And so as we think about that, combined, unexcused, excused, and suspension, I see that a lot of school staffs, when they start looking at those numbers, they realize we have a lot more students than we might have anticipated who are in this category of chronic absenteeism. So what I'd like to do now, I'm going to have you guys participate a little bit for the next couple of minutes. Jackie is going to open a poll, and so you should have a little box or something that opens on your screen, and it's going to ask you to answer this question. What percentage of your student body is chronically absent at this point in the school year? And you may not currently track this data, so give your best guess if you don't know. And what I'm looking for is basically to get a sense of, we've had about 50 to 60 days of school at this point in most schools, and so consider how many kids in your school system have missed 5 or more days or 6 or more days, depending on how many days of school. If you're a classroom teacher, go ahead and just estimate this percentage for your classroom. If you're an administrator or other sort of school-level personnel, why don't you make an estimate for your whole school? And if you work in a district, you're at the district office or you're some sort of district administrator, go ahead and make an estimate for your district. And one of the things that we want to make note of is that within a district, if you're estimating for this, you may have some schools where it's a very low percentage of students, like 3 or 4%, whereas another school in your district that has students with higher risk factors, maybe that has more issues with school-wide climate or classroom climate, the percentage may be much higher. So in some districts, we've got some schools 3 or 4% students chronically absent, and in other schools in the same district, it could be 40 or 50%. So go ahead and make that estimate. We're going to give about another 30 seconds or 1 minute for that poll to come in, and then I'll share where we're at with that. And while you guys are doing your estimate, let me give you a little preface of what's going to be coming for the rest of the webinar. I'm going to share some data on the negative effects next, what we know from research. And you may have already thought through a lot of these negative effects. You may already know some of this data, but what I want to do is really equip you with some concrete facts and some concrete research that you could use to share with staff, students, and families, and really build some momentum to tackle this critical issue of absenteeism. I'm then going to be sharing some school-wide strategies with you, and then moving into more the individual student intervention piece and how we can start start applying some function-based thinking and some small group and intensive individual student interventions. So Jackie, let's go ahead and close that poll, and hopefully we'll get a little pop-up of the responses here so that I can get a sense of how much of an issue we think this might be within our schools. And I'm not currently seeing the response window. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue moving forward. Oh, okay, there it is. So hopefully you can see this off to the right side of your screen. We've got 11% that responded. We think we've got about 0 to 5% of our student body, 36% who responded 5 to 10%, 20% of you responded 11 to 20%, 7%, 21 to 30, 3%, 31, and we had about 20% of you who didn't respond. So we're seeing pretty widespread here of the extent of the problem, and what I do recommend is that after the webinar today, I'm going to share with you how to break down your data to figure out these percentages school-wide. I do recommend that you go back to your schools or back to your district and try and gather this data just so that you can get a really clear picture of what is the extent of the problem, and do we want to focus more initially on school-wide prevention if it's a larger issue, or are we just going to go straight to some individual intervention that may be effective if we've got only, 3 or 4% of our students who are in this chronic absence category? So moving forward, obviously sort of the most obvious negative effect is going to be on students' academic achievement. And this is very clear across grade levels, but I wanted to share something with you about the effect of early absences, students in kindergarten and first grade, and how detrimental the effects are on their academic achievement when they're missing 10% or more of the school year. And there was a study that was done in California that looked at students' third grade reading proficiency. So they were looking at how many students were passing at grade level in third grade for reading, and they found that when students had regular attendance in kindergarten and first grade, 64% were passing their statewide tests. And, 64% is not where we need to be. We would hope that we are really working to move that number towards 100%, but it's significantly better than students who were chronically absent in kindergarten and first grade. Only 17% were passing their third grade reading test. And so this really tells us there is some very important information that we should be sharing with staff members, with students, and with families, that kindergarten and first grade is such a critical time for students to build foundational skills and to get regular practice, that if they're missing even a day every couple of weeks, there's a real strong likelihood they're going to be set up for some long-term difficulties with school success. Now, the next piece is just sort of our conservative estimate. I said, again, we don't have this data nationwide, so this is based on about 9 states. Our conservative estimates are that there are about 10% of our kindergarten and first grade students who are missing a month or more of school each year, and that in some of our schools it's up to 50% of students who are chronically absent, and that up to 50% is actually from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade, that in some schools we just have extremely high numbers of students who are missing really dangerous amounts of school. Now, our next piece is that we've got very, very strong evidence that there are negative effects of absenteeism on our graduation rates. And Attendance Works, which is one of the sort of leading organizations that's driving this charge for how do we address chronic absenteeism, they're just a fabulous organization, and I'll share their website at the end of the webinar. They found from some studies that by 6th grade, chronic absenteeism is actually one of our best predictors of whether or not a student is at risk of dropping out of high school. So if we can look at chronic absenteeism as a red flag, students with numerous behavioral referrals, and students who have failing grades in math and or English, any one of those or a combination of those are real red flags that these students are significantly at risk, and so that's going to trigger some intervention on our part. By ninth grade, regular and high attendance is actually a better predictor of our graduation rates than our eighth grade test scores. And I found that was just absolutely fascinating and really important information, that it's not just a student's ability and sort of natural facility with test taking and their ability at eighth grade, but whether or not they're actually in school to gain the knowledge that they need and to be engaged in school is going to predict whether or not they're going to graduate. This was also corroborated by a large study that was done by the Utah Education Policy Center. They looked at all of the students in Utah and found that if a student was chronically absent any time between 8th and 12th grade, this is any year, but it increases if it was multiple years, students were 7.4 times more likely to drop out than students who were in school regularly. We can also expand this to not just the academic effects, but there are significant negative life effects. And within school, one of the discussions that I've had with a lot of staff members is that teachers and other staff see that when students are missing frequent amounts of school, they're really not developing some of the life skills that they need to be successful. And the most obvious one is social and friendship skills. And so I've had teachers share with me, in elementary school that so-and-so misses all the time and so never develops strong friendships with other students, or when he or she comes back to school, their best friend has moved on to someone else, and so it creates rifts within the classroom. But there's also the effect of, as teachers move into lots of partner and cooperative group activities, there's a real risk that if a student is missing all of the time, no one wants to partner or be in a group with that student because they're never there to contribute. And so partners and group members end up feeling like they're doing all of the work. There's also an emerging body of research, if we look at that second bullet point, that's pointing to if students are missing frequent amounts of school, they're not developing this really important trait of resilience. And some of that may be because absenteeism is triggered by the student wanting to escape a problem at school, whether it's academic, whether it's conflict with peers or teachers, or some sort of bullying situation, that the students, if they're staying home to escape those issues, just are not learning coping skills, they're not learning self-advocacy skills, and they're not learning the things that they need to overcome obstacles. On the last bullet point, dependability, this is a real critical thing to think about, that we are wanting to develop the habits, traits, and attitudes that are going to help our students be successful beyond school. And dependability is one of the best predictors of whether someone is going to keep a job and advance through the ranks, sometimes even more than talent or innate ability. It's whether or not a person shows up on time, it's whether or not they do their work and they're there regularly. And I think if we don't help our students develop dependability while they're still in school, it's going to be very difficult for them to just flip that switch when they then enter the world of work. When we also look at negative life and community effects, one bullet point that I forgot to add in here that you might just write in if you've printed out the slides for this or just make note of is if we think about that correlation of absenteeism with dropout and we think about the both negative life effects for the student themselves but also the community effects of students who drop out, it makes it much more difficult for students to get a living wage job. If they've dropped out of school, we'll end up with more folks on social welfare, so there's those effects. But as you can see here, there's also a real strong increased likelihood of involvement in our criminal justice system. And this first study was from Rhode Island, and they found that of the students in their juvenile justice system in Rhode Island, over 3/4 of them had histories of chronic absence. So very strong correlation there. And numerous studies, as you can see listed down at the bottom of the second bullet point, are that truant students are more likely to be arrested, they're more likely to engage in serious property crime or commit assault both during their school years but also after. So there's some real strong reasons that we need to address this issue. When we look at the extent of the problem, our best estimates are that between 10 to 15% of our students nationwide are chronically absent, and that equates to 5 million to 7.5 million. Our indicators are showing that this is probably a conservative estimate, and as more research is coming out, We're thinking it may actually be higher than that, but currently we're looking at up to 7.5 million kids who are in this really at-risk category nationwide. And another thing that's really important to make note of is that chronic absenteeism is far more prevalent for students who are economically disadvantaged, students who are living in situations of poverty. And in several of the states where they've looked at this statewide, they've actually found that it's up to 2/3 of the students who are chronically absent, or in one state they found it was 70% of the students who are chronically absent were also economically disadvantaged. So as we look at trying to improve our outcomes for students who are coming from situations of poverty, addressing this absenteeism issue is going to be absolutely a sort of first step. So our goal should be that all students are fitting into the category of regular attendance. And what does that mean? So basically, regular attendance means students who miss 5% or less of school in an academic year. And again, we're looking at percentages so that we can track this across the course of the school year. But our goal would be that by the end of the year, every student has 9 days or less absence. And that averages out to no more than 1 day per month on average. And I think we've got in a lot of school systems sort of a long way to go. We're very far from this mark. And so this is where we're going to look at, we may need to implement more than just intervention because we have so many students that we need to try and improve their attendance to reach this goal of regular attendance. So our starting place, as I said before, is we've got to regularly monitor our data and set priorities based on that data. Part of the priority setting will be deciding, are we going to prioritize our initial efforts more on universal preventative strategies if we have lots of kids who are absent, or are we going to go straight to more individual or small group intervention if it's a manageable number of students? So we're going to talk about how to implement preventative school-wide measures, and then we're also going to look at function-based and research-based interventions for small groups and individuals. So let's start with the data piece. Our recommendation is that on a regular basis, you calculate the following 4 attendance categories for your whole school or for your whole district. So you're looking at regular attendance, students who have missed 5% or less, at risk, students who are between 5 and 10%, any student who is chronically absent, which is 10% or more, and severe chronic absence is defined as students who are missing 20% or more. And those are your students who just really are going to probably need some more intensive intervention because they're missing such a critical amount of school. And these pieces of data are basically drawn from looking at student outcomes, and what they've found is that when students miss 5% or less, the likelihood that they're struggling in school and having negative effects due to absenteeism is fairly low. In the at-risk category, we see that some students, if their absenteeism is at this rate, they may be having more struggles, they may be starting to show more risk factors, but when a student reaches chronic absence or severe chronic absence, they are very likely to suffer from some of the negative effects that I mentioned previously. So how do we collect this school-wide data? I'm going to show you just one example of how you would do this for one of the attendance categories and give you just sort of the general process, and then I'll show you with a specific school example so that hopefully it's very clear. Your data systems may actually already do this for you, where you could just enter a date range and indicate the percentage or the number of days that you want to print. But for some of you, you may need to use this process if your system doesn't already collect this data for you. So print a list of all students who have been absent 10% or more of days in the current school year at whatever point you're tracking this data. And remember that this list should include a combination of excused, unexcused, and suspension data. So the 10% is based on a collected piece of those three reasons for absenteeism. Count up the number of students on that printed list, and then divide the number of students who are chronically absent, the number of students from step 2, by the number of enrolled students in your school. And one thing to note about this is that in most systems, this actually isn't going to account for students who arrive after day one of school. So if you have students who enter after day one, that we may need to actually calculate their individual category, whether they're regular attendee, at risk, chronic, or severe chronic. You may have to do that by hand. So you would just keep a list of all of the students who enroll after day one, how many days they've been in school at that point, and then calculate where they fit based on their number of absences. And we would use this same procedure. Remember, this procedure that I just outlined is for chronic absence, but I would do that same thing for each of the other attendance categories using the percentages I outlined on the previous slide. Okay, so let's look at a specific school example. So if I worked in a school with 1,500 students, and it's day 60 in the school year. So I'm going to try and figure out what percentage of my students are chronically absent. So if it's day 60 in the school year, I need to print a list of all of the students who have missed 6 or more days, because 6 is 10% of 60. And let's hypothetically say that I counted 217 students on that list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide the number of chronically absent students, 217, by my total number of enrolled students, which is 1,500. And if I did my math correctly, what we end up with is 14.5% of the student body in this hypothetical school is chronically absent. And what that tells me is that, if I have 14.5% or 217 students in this school, that's likely going to be too many students for me to do individual intervention that's really meaningful with each of those 217 students. So what we want to figure out is, from this data, do we need to start with Schoolwide and do some individual intervention concurrently but really prioritize our resources, or do we have the intervention systems available to intervene with this number of students? And I would say in most schools, 217 is probably too many to do meaningful individual intervention. So what we're going to do with that is we're going to develop these red flag systems for individual support. Any student who is identified as having chronic absence is going to be red flagged, and we'll make decisions about how do we utilize our resources to provide intervention. For any student who is in that severe chronic absence category, which is 20% or more of days, we probably want to start out with some pretty intensive intervention and just really try and address this quickly so that the student doesn't continue to miss highly worrisome levels of school. And we'll connect those students to our intervention systems based on their level of need. But if we find that too many of our students are chronically absent, we may need to intervene with a manageable number of kids based on the resources we have available, put the remainder of the students on a wait list while we intensify school-wide universal prevention efforts to try and reduce the number of kids on this list. And so let's move over to now talking about some strategies for universal prevention. The first piece here is that in most schools, we could do a far better job of publicizing the importance of attendance. And going back to my initial slide that for students to be successful in school, they need to be in school, it's sort of a no-brainer, but I think that we need to do a better job of really bringing it to the forefront of everyone's attention so that we can build some momentum behind addressing this issue. And that includes publicizing to staff, families, students, and community. So let me give you an example for each of those demographics of some publicizing that we could do to increase awareness. For staff, it might be useful to share some data, and that was part of the reason why I shared some of the national data on negative outcomes. And we could also share our school-wide data. I've seen some schools actually do some really great investigation of students in different attendance categories and how it's affecting graduation rates or how it's affecting their passing grades and passing state tests scores, and oftentimes what they find is the attendance data really does correlate with better test scores, better grades versus worst test scores, worse grades. The second bullet point that I have there is an activity that I've found is very, very strong in working with staff members, where you have each staff member, each of these bullet points would be a box or a part of a column in a table, and you have each staff member brainstorm individually, what are the negative effects on a student who is chronically absent inside the school setting, but also think outside of the school setting. So people start considering, well, students may get involved in gangs, students may get involved in illegal activities, they don't develop habits and traits that they need to. Then you have them move on to what are the negative effects on the classroom setting itself as well as the teacher, what are some negative effects on the parents, and what are negative effects on the community, and then have staff share this with each other and then sort of share as a whole group. And what you find is staff members are identifying so many different negative effects that even though they may have already known some of these things intuitively before, by sitting down and doing this activity, they then really see, wow, we do need to address this, and it is such a critical thing that there's some momentum built behind it. Moving on to increasing family awareness. This is just a sample from Randy Sprick's Revised Foundations. We included it in there because there's a section on addressing absenteeism. But it's basically a sample letter that you could send home at the beginning of the school year. It starts out, "Dear families, we're looking forward to a great year with students in class and ready to learn. We've learned that students who miss even a few days of school are at far greater risk of academic failure and dropout," etc. And it goes on to describe some of the measures that the school might do to help students if they're struggling with attendance. Now, the part that I think is really slick that's down at the bottom of your screen is this little color-coded chart. And what a school could do is either on a half sheet of like cardstock paper, or in some schools they could even decide to create like a refrigerator magnet. You could send this home to every family when you send this initial letter that's emphasizing attendance is important and we're going to be addressing it this year. And basically what this chart does is you would tell families and train families and students that anytime a student is absent, regardless of the reason, you go to that refrigerator magnet or you go to the folder, wherever this is in the household, record the date and the absence reason. And the goal is that by the end of the school year, the student has not missed more than these 9 boxes. And you'll see as it gets over to absence 10 plus, we start seeing yellow and red color coding, and it indicates that students with each absence beyond that point are at increased risk for failures and school difficulties. Now, when we look at universal prevention, this is likely not going to change the behavior of every student and every family, but there are a lot of really well-intentioned parents, students who want their students to be at school, want them to be successful, but they just lose track over time in their busy schedule. And so for some students, a simple monitoring strategy like this might make a difference in helping them attend regularly. Now let's move on to a few more strategies for increasing family awareness. We could also share some of the negative outcomes and detrimental effects that have been shown in research. And the study that I shared with you folks about the kindergarten and first grade effect on reading outcomes in third grade, that's a piece of information that I think should be shared in detail with every family that is entering kindergarten and first grade, and that we should really make an effort to educate our parents. This is such a critical time. We need our kids in school regularly. We could also share our school goals and data about what's going on in the school with average daily attendance, as well as percentages of students who are chronically absent or regularly present. And across the year, we could also share each individual student's data with families, like sending a letter home that indicates what category their student is in and how many days they've missed. The last bullet point here is some possibilities that we could use for messaging to families about strategies that might improve attendance. So if we see that lots of families are struggling because they haven't created consistent routines at home, or we see that lots of students are struggling because they're not getting the sleep that they need, we could send home just some general memos, newsletters, etc., that provide tips on how to deal with those issues. Same thing for any other major issue, like if we have lots of students who are having trouble with anxiety, lots of students who are struggling with homework or test requirements, or students who are having lots of conflicts at school, we could use some school-wide messaging to families about how to help their students address those issues. With our students, we can do lots more to increase awareness and motivation to attend school, and this could be something that classroom teachers do as well as the whole school. So this first piece here of teaching the importance of school with young students, we could use some sort of tried and true strategies by using social stories. You'll see an example there below. And with this social story or any other that was developed, a teacher could just make it part of their morning routine to recite a line and have students echo it back. Then they recite the next line, students echo it, just really building that idea that we're going to take a couple of minutes each morning to make this a part of our habit and routine so that students understand this is very important. The same thing could be done with sorts of songs or chants in classrooms with younger students. And as students get older, we could do lessons like the following. And I was a teacher of students with emotional and behavioral disorders in middle school. Their attendance was often atrocious, and we did this lesson, and I found it just created a really great opportunity for dialogue with the kids. And so we started out with sort of the hook, the fun activity. What would you do with $250,000? And so students brainstormed, they shared, we discussed it, we listed it on the board. Then the next question, what would you do with $1 million? And so kids are telling me, I'd buy a Lamborghini, I would do this, I would do that. And then we shared the data, nationwide data, that a high school graduate makes on average $250,000 more than a student who drops out over a lifetime, whereas a college graduate makes on average $1 million more than a student who graduates high school. And then we correlate that to the chronic absenteeism data. So students who are chronically absent are far more likely to drop out. That means if you're missing 2 days or more of school each month, it's going to make it more difficult for you to graduate. And this is where the discussion piece came in, and I just found that my students really were able to open up once we did this activity. What things are making it difficult for you to attend? And they shared and we discussed it. And then we had them do some goal setting as well as brainstorming. What can you do to overcome the difficulties? But also, what can I do as your teacher? What can we do in the school system? What could I work with your parents on or your guardians on to help you overcome these difficulties? And we just were able to make a lot of headway with the attendance issue when we found a foot in the door to have these meaningful discussions. The next piece is a motivational strategy, and this is basically a group contingency, but it's also a data collection piece, and we're increasing awareness with students. So you'll see this could be a large classroom graph that was posted somewhere prominently in the classroom. Days of the week are listed on the x-axis, and the number of students present each day is listed on the y-axis. If you look at the initial dots on this system, you'll see that in this classroom they were only having about 23 or 24 students out of 30 that were present each day. So this teacher decided to set a goal that we're not going to be able to go from 23 or 24 all the way to 30. It's not reasonable. So we're going to set our goal at 27. And in some classrooms, simply by taking this data and creating some emphasis and each morning making it a habit, we count up the number of students and we put the data on the chart. In some classrooms, that's enough to start seeing some behavioral change. But this teacher might have enhanced it, as you can see here, by adding a little reinforcement system to it. So in this system, Mrs. Sparks, the teacher, basically said for each day that the students met or exceeded their goal, they were earning a point towards a mystery reward. And at the end of the session today, I'll share a mystery motivator system, but it's basically just a reinforcement system that sort of plays on people's interest in playing the lottery. So it just creates that mystery element that adds an element of surprise and anticipation for students. The next piece is increasing community awareness, and Attendance Works, the organization that I mentioned earlier, and again I'll share their website at the end of the session, they've got some great recommendations for public service announcements, ways to utilize local media and local sports stars or political stars to share the school's goals and the information about reducing chronic absenteeism. And this can just be a great way to create a community emphasis on this issue. We've also worked with schools who have done a great job connecting with local businesses. Number one, to address any areas of concern. And one of the most obvious examples of this is if you found in your school system that lots of students were missing because of medical or dental appointments, it might be logical to contact the medical and dental offices in your community and just ask for their help in helping families schedule appointments outside of school hours when possible. Another example is there was an example of students were frequently coming very late to school because they were stopping at a 7-Eleven or some other convenience store, and one school was actually able to talk to the convenience store, and this must have been a very willing and able convenience store. They actually bent over backwards to reduce this problem for the school, and they actually closed their doors for the hour prior to school starting, or like the half an hour prior to school starting, up until a half an hour after school started, and that reduced the problem significantly. Now, not all businesses are going to be willing to go to those lengths of actually closing their doors, but we might be able to find some partners where we didn't expect them. In other cases, businesses might be willing to offer incentive opportunities like reduced cost driver insurance for parents or students who have regular attendance. Some stores and other businesses might be willing to offer coupons to any student who has regular attendance, et cetera. And lastly, we can work more to connect with our community partners who may be able to help our students who have significant struggles that lead to absenteeism, like folks in DHS, CPS, or juvenile justice, as well as utilizing our community leaders and organizers to help spread this message. So if we've got faith-based organizations that are very strong and powerful amongst the community, would those faith-based leaders be willing to work with their congregations or their community to try and help address the issue of absenteeism? And lastly, on the school-wide piece, these are very, very large considerations, so I'm just going to make quick mention of them. But if we identify that large numbers of students are missing school because of any concerns within the school about climate or safety, or if we're finding that lots of students are missing because of frequent suspensions, then those are some pieces that we may need to start thinking, how are we going to do some staff development? How are we going to do some school-wide efforts to address those climate and safety concerns or the negative relationship between staff members and students, et cetera. And similarly, if there are any barriers or other challenges that are affecting large numbers of families, are there school-wide pieces we could put in place to make a difference? So let's take a look now at causes of absenteeism. And I have here that we're going to want to be looking at both causes for school-wide, large numbers of students missing, but also as we start moving into the individual intervention piece, we really want to be considering what are the reasons behind absenteeism, and this will help us put interventions in place that are much more likely to be effective. So I always have people start with these three questions. What is preventing attendance? Is there something that's actually making it so the student can't attend? Why does the student or parent feel it's necessary to miss school? So is there some sort of value judgment there or something else that's outweighing? And what is the student or parent getting from the student being absent? And have there at the bottom that prevention and intervention must address those causes. And what ends up happening sometimes with our interventions is we put some really good things in place, but they don't consider those questions of what is driving the absenteeism. And so we find that our interventions don't work. So I'm really quickly going to give you, I'm just going to read you a quick little story about a student, and then I'm going to ask you a follow-up question that's going to be another poll, and ask you to answer why were the interventions that the school put in place ineffective at changing this student's attendance in the long term. Because what you'll see is that with the things that the school tries, they actually do make a difference in the short term with Janelle's attendance, but it doesn't last. So why didn't the intervention last? All right, so Janelle has extreme anxiety about speaking in class. Her anxiety has gotten so bad she feels ill before school and often gets permission from her mom to stay home. The school talks with Janelle and her mother about the importance of regular attendance. Janelle and her mother agree that she needs to attend more consistently, and Janelle's mom says she's really going to try and make Janelle go to school. So unless Janelle is showing some really serious critical illness symptoms, she's going to be going to school. And as a way to emphasize this, the school has Janelle sign a behavior contract. And along with the behavior contract, they start a reward system that's giving her gift certificates to her favorite store when she makes improvements in her attendance. And so what the school sees is Janelle's attendance improves for a short period of time, but then after a little while, her mom is continuing to drop her off and be consistent with getting her to school. But once Janelle's mom has dropped her off at school, Janelle sneaks out of the school and goes back home once her mom has gone to work. So with this example, what I'd like you to answer, and Jackie, I'm going to have you open the poll again, is the answer to this question. The interventions that the school tried were ineffective in the long term because A, Janelle just didn't care about school. B, Janelle didn't value the rewards that could be earned, so she didn't really care about those gift certificates. C, the interventions did not address the cause of absenteeism, which was anxiety about speaking in class. Or D, the school didn't implement solid research-based interventions. So take a moment to reflect and select the one of these that you think best answers that question. And I'm going to give you a little hint that on a few of them, we don't know for sure. But there is one of these that really kind of goes to the forefront of why this intervention didn't work in the long term. So take maybe just another 20 seconds or so to answer that question. And Jackie, can we close the poll and get the results up? And as those are coming up, I'm just going to kind of take these one by one. So on A, Janelle just didn't care about school. That's a possibility, but at this point, we don't really know. And so without that information about does she just not care, and usually there's something that contributes to a student not caring, we're going to move on to the next possibility. Janelle didn't value the rewards that could be earned. And that one is less likely because we saw that her behavior improved for a short period of time. And so what we're hypothesizing is that she likely did value those rewards, and so she was working towards them for a period of time. But that moves us on to C. The cause of her absenteeism was anxiety about speaking in class. And without addressing that cause, even if she wants those rewards, even if she cares about school, and even if the school did implement some solid interventions, which is D, because we didn't address the cause, her anxiety, she's not going to be able to sustain her better behavior. And what I see is that most of you on this poll did identify okay, actually a lot of you identified D, but several of you did identify C. And so with D, let me speak to that for just a moment. The school actually did implement some really good pieces. And so I mentioned before that some of our initial steps with intervention are going to be talking and informing students and families about why attendance is so important. And the school did start with that. We also see that both Janelle and her mom agreed that she needed to attend school. And so if I were the interventionist at this point, I'd be at least cautiously optimistic that we've got the mom and the student saying that they're on board. Because sometimes that's not always the case, as we know. And so then the school goes on and they implemented a behavior contract. They used a reward-based system with some pretty high-value rewards for Janelle. And behavioral contracts as well as structured reinforcement systems do have really strong basis in the research. So the school did implement some solid research-based interventions, but they didn't address the cause. So that was a little bit of a loaded question because, yes, they implemented research-based interventions, but they weren't necessarily the right interventions based on this student's issue. So let's take a little bit more look at this. Janelle's problem was anxiety. Even if she wanted those gift certificates, because the intervention didn't address the reason, over time her anxiety outweighed that motivation for the reinforcement, and that's why she wasn't able to sustain her better attendance. So this is where we start looking at functional behavioral approaches. And as we get to more intensive levels of this, with students who have been resistant to more early stage interventions, we do recommend moving towards a functional behavioral assessment approach, but we can also just start thinking function at earlier stages. And basically with functional behavioral approaches, we're looking at systematic evidence-based approaches for looking at why does a behavior occur within the context or the environment. And so if you look at these three boxes, basically the way we break this down is through the ABCs, looking at what triggers the behavior, and in this case the behavior is absenteeism. So what triggers the student's absenteeism, and what is the consequence that the student gets out of that behavior that then reinforces it? So what is the outcome that in some way is positive for the student? So let's look at this for Janelle. The antecedent for Janelle was she has anxiety about speaking out in class. And so that leads her to be absent. She starts feeling ill. She doesn't want to go to school because she doesn't want to speak. And so when she's absent, she then escapes those feelings of anxiety. And one of the things that I encourage you to think about as you start designing interventions for individual students is that if it's a problem like anxiety, or if it's a problem like an academic deficit or a social skills deficit, that likely our interventions are going to take some time for the students to learn the skills that will help them be successful long term. So for a student who has anxiety, we're not going to be able to immediately eliminate that anxiety. And so what we need to think about is some short-term solutions that allow the student to escape whatever that problem is. So in this case, if Janelle is feeling major anxiety, we need some short-term solutions that are going to allow her to escape the anxiety so that she actually comes to school to get our longer-term interventions. So let's look at some short-term solutions. If you look at that first line of white text, we could talk to Janelle's teachers about not calling on her to speak in class. And we could actually talk to Janelle and let her know teachers have agreed they're not going to call on you in class, but they are going to use some alternate participation methods to make sure that you're still participating. So they may come in and do some individual check-ins with you. They may have you do some written responses when others are doing verbal responses. And one strategy that might be really beneficial to teach teachers would be a strategy like when you're circulating as students are writing responses or telling their partner a response, we could go in and check with Janelle and figure out which answer she had correct, and then ask her, would you be willing to respond to that question? If she says no, then the teacher won't call on her. But for a lot of students, the anxiety comes from that vulnerability of not knowing if they have the correct response and not wanting to look foolish in front of peers. So for some students, that pre-correction strategy of going and telling them, oh, you got a great answer for number 2, can I call on you? It takes away that vulnerability and allows them to overcome that anxiety. Now, we don't want to do this in the long term because someday Janelle is going to have to learn how to speak in front of others. So in the long term, we're going to want to work with Janelle on coping strategies. And we might enhance this by, while we're working on coping strategies, we continue using the behavior contract for improved attendance, but we also include opportunities for rewards whenever Janelle attempts to speak in class. So you can see we're looking at short-term and long-term solutions. Now, as we look at this function piece, we want to consider the common causes of absenteeism to help us identify what interventions are going to be the most effective. And these are really broken into sort of 4 distinct categories. The first one is barriers, and that's anything that is preventing the student from attending, like a chronic illness, transportation problems, financial difficulties that make it so that the student can't get to school for some reason or has to stay home and watch siblings or something like that. We also have students where it's simply a lack of understanding by either the student or the family, or there's a lack of emphasis on the importance of school. And in some families and some communities, there's actually a real resistance to school. And so that's going to be a different approach than if it's the student just doesn't understand why missing school is important. The next big category is students who miss school to escape or avoid something. And in terms of deficits, academic deficits are one of the ones that we really need to pay attention to, partially because even if the academic deficit is not what's driving the initial absenteeism, the longer the student has been gone, the more they fall behind, and then the more likely that that then becomes a function of the absenteeism. But another thing that's really supported in research is that if there are any sorts of climate or safety concerns within the school, if the student is being bullied, if there are lots of conflict issues, if there are lots of fights, negative relationships with teachers, then the student may be absent from school simply to escape or avoid those climate concerns. And lastly, we've got students who are obtaining something outside of school that's more reinforcing than the rewards of school. So students who are getting peer attention or adult attention at home, students who are being involved in illegal or gang activities, students who have access to video or computer games that may be more reinforcing than my math class where I struggle. And so what you may see is that for some students, it's actually a combination of one or more of these issues. Now, I recognize we are getting close to our end of time here, so I'm just really quickly going to go through the next information. Remember, if you do need to log off based on time, we are sending out a video link of this webinar in the next several days, and so you can feel free to watch the remainder of this and have the question and answer section later. But I am going to try and get through the remainder of the information, which is just a few more slides. So we always start with our intervention efforts by collecting data. And if we don't immediately know why the student is absent, we may need to do some additional fact-finding. And so we could do a survey with the student. We could do some interviews with teachers, the student themselves, or parents. We could do some observation or some screening, like academic screening, to identify if there's an academic or a behavioral problem that is contributing to the student's difficulties. We could look at records review. And we could also track incidents over time and see if we can identify any patterns in why the student is missing, where it's happening, and when. And so let me give you one intervention example, and then we'll conclude the webinar. And this intervention is actually something that could be used for lots of different functions. It's probably most effective when a student is motivated by peer attention. So the example here is that if a student is influenced by a group of peers to skip when he's on the way to school, and they go buy snacks and video games, so the cause of absenteeism is getting peer attention or influence. This intervention is a group contingency intervention, which basically provides rewards for improved attendance in a group setting. And so it addresses that function. But this intervention could actually be a really simple early intervention to try with students, even if we're not sure what the function is, to see if just simply putting this attention and a little bit of a reward-based system in place can help the student without having to do more intensive intervention. So in this example, we would want to include the two peers who were also absent. So if the student was being motivated by other kids in the school to skip, we might want to include those peers. But we also want to make sure that we include at least a few peers who are sort of peer models. And folks, we want to make sure that these are kids that our target student looks up to, enjoys interacting with, but who are also regularly present so that there's some buy-in based on those peers. And with this group, we would brainstorm a menu of rewards with the students. I put snacks and video game time might be logical rewards here because that's the reason that the students were skipping, was to go get snacks and video game. But we would also brainstorm with the kids lots of no-cost, low-cost items, all the way up to some high-cost items, and that could be either time or money. And then what we would do with them is each Monday we select a mystery motivator. And mystery motivator is basically we just take all of the possible rewards that students identified. We have lots of the low-cost, no-cost ones, some of the medium cost, and one or two of the high-cost ones. And from that bucket of possible prizes, we would select one, seal it in an envelope without looking at it and put a question mark on the front, so nobody knows what the reward is going to be. And so we would draw that on Monday, and each day the group is going to report to an adult to get their attendance recorded, possibly receive a snack, and then on Friday we're going to figure out who earned that mystery reward. So you'll see we've got 10 numbers here, and we would put each of these numbers on a note card, 1, 2, 3. You see there's 3 4s, 3 5s. And so notice there's lots more of the higher numbers than the lower numbers, because what we're doing is on Friday we draw one of these numbers from the list of 10, and all students who had that number or higher of days of attendance that week is going to get the mystery motivator. So if I draw 4, any student who had 4 days of attendance or better is going to earn the reward. And so it's basically just kind of stacking the deck that the better your attendance is, the more likely you are to earn the reward. And that's part of the reason that we include some of those peer models, because we want kids to see that, when you attend regularly, you get that reward. So in conclusion, I've got just a couple of additional tools and strategies here. The first one, if you're interested, you can visit www.pacificnorthwestpublish.com. That's the publishing company that has published these 2 resources. And Dr. Bill Jensen, who's out of University of Utah and developed the Tough Kid materials, which are just phenomenal resources for helping teachers work with students who struggle with behavior. He, in conjunction with several other authors, including Randy Sprick and myself, developed a functional behavior assessment of absenteeism and truancy, and along with that, it includes a book that has 25 individual student interventions and 5 universal prevention procedures. So there's the functional behavior assessment kit, which includes interviews, observations, discipline records, reviews, basically all of the data tools that you might need to actually determine why a student is absent. And it comes with this intervention book included so that you can sort of pair it with some meaningful logical interventions. And for anyone who was a participant today and who was registered, when we send out the link to the webinar, we are going to include a 10% off coupon for these 2 products. And so if you are interested in these resources, go to that website and you can find out more information. And I do recommend that all of you take a few moments at some point during your busy schedule to check out www.attendanceworks.org because they really are leading a lot of the research, a lot of the interventions, and working with schools and districts on how to tackle these issues. And they've got a lot of free resources as well as links to research articles and things that are just phenomenal places to start if you're looking for additional tools and strategies. If you're also interested in more information on optional training support, you can contact Safe and Civil Schools. The number is listed there. And I truly want to thank you for your time and your willingness to tackle this issue. It is of such critical importance, and I'm so excited to see that there's so many folks who are hungry for some ways to address this. So I think we are at the close of my planned portion of today, and so let's see if we have any questions.
Hi, Jessica. It looks like I have just 2 questions that have sort of come up that are based on the content from the webinar. The first one was when you were talking about Janelle and the examples and the interventions. We had a query about that example and asking if it was based on interview. And that was when you're referring back to slide number 42, if that helps.
And I'm not 100% sure with that question. If we still have the attendee online, feel free to type in a little bit more information. Was the question based on figuring out that the function was anxiety and that we got that information from interview? Because if that's the case, basically that example was designed to start after we've already collected the data. And so it was a little bit of a loaded example because we already know the function behind it. But that information definitely could have been collected from interviews. It probably could have been collected from observations as well. So we might have gone into the classroom setting and observed that, we're seeing some significant signs of anxiety whenever she's called on, or that she shuts down when she's called on. But that's definitely where those sources of interview or observation can provide us the information that we need to then determine that it was anxiety or whatever the cause is. So, Jackie, if we get some follow-up on that, feel free to let me know. What was the second question?
There was a second question to that, was asking that what did Sandra mean based on the interview? Was there a particular form used? And so that
back to Janelle as well.
Back to Janelle. It was a question based off of Sandra.
And I'm going to admit that this example came from some of my personal experience working as a dean of students, and this was just a student that I had observed and sort of noticed that this was the function. But definitely the interviews, the observations that Bill and Randy and I and the other authors developed in the FBA kit, I think would guide you to the same type of information. So interviews are a very good way for us to get some good information from teachers or students or parents in identifying some trends.
Okay. It looks like we've got a couple other questions trickling in, Jess, which I could forward to you, or I can give you now, and you can see if you think that there's something you can cover very briefly.
Why don't we go ahead and do that?
Why use a behavior contract instead of an attendance contract?
So I think that's just a difference in terminology, and you could easily refer to it as an attendance contract. Behavior contract is just what the intervention is referred to in the research literature, that we're setting a goal based on some aspect of behavior, which could be attendance, it could be any sort of disciplinary issue, and then we're working towards logical rewards and consequences based on that. So the only reason that I used behavior contract is just because it's a recognized intervention within the research literature for sort of any problematic behavior, including attendance.
Okay. And another question is, can you speak more about climate, in quotes, climate?
Climate, okay. So basically when I'm referring to climate, that's based on a body of research that's indicated that highly punitive climates where teachers really rely on punitive consequences as their main disciplinary technique, as their main form of interaction with students, things like whether or not a school has really clearly addressed and taught school-wide or classroom procedures and routines to students so that there's a sort of teaching approach to developing appropriate behavior, whether or not students are taught conflict resolution, bullying prevention techniques, that any of these types of climate and safety concerns can lead to students feeling disengaged from school or feeling like there's a reason that they need to escape from school. So climate is sort of a large consideration that are there any aversive aspects to the school environment that may be making it that students don't want to be there.
Fantastic. That looks like it's it. Again, we will send a link to the recording of the webinar along with a copy of the slides that you can print out and utilize in your own research and looking at this attendance information. Those will go out to you in the next day or so via email. If you have additional questions, you can email us at Pacific Northwest Publishing to the same email that you got the link for the webinar, and we can help get those answers, or sorry, those questions to Jessica to get answered. Thanks again, Jessica, for your time, and thanks to everybody who joined us today and took some time out of their busy schedule to find out more about this.
Thank you, everyone.